It is great to see a room filled with people who are dedicating their lives and their focus and their energy on religious freedom. We're going to jump into a panel, and we're going to do it quickly because our time is short, and I think we could talk for 22 hours, but I understand it's 22 minutes if I'm looking at the clock correctly. About the topic of why international religious freedom is good for all. I am thrilled to have a panel of experts and friends to discuss this topic. So I'm just going to go down the line and ask Brett and down to the colleagues, why is IRF good for all, or is it? Because I think it's worth asking. I think it's worth reiterating the case for it as we start our conversation.
Well, if you think about it, religious freedom is really the taproot of all human rights. If you think of the important rights in our First Amendment, freedom of speech emerged out of a struggle for religious dissenters to speak. Freedom of the press emerged from a struggle to print the Bible in a vernacular that people could read. Freedom of association emerged from a struggle of religious dissenters to be able to gather and worship together. Even the right to petition the government, if you go and look at the historical record, many of those petitions came from people who were being persecuted on the basis of religion. Without religious freedom, I fear that what we'll end up with is a cut flower human rights culture where these other beautiful freedoms are severed from the taproot that genuinely gives them sustenance.
I love that, the taproot that gives it sustenance. Nury, when you think of this question of why IRF is good for all, what's your answer to that?
The international religious freedom, to me, in addition to the historical value-based argument, to me, it's a way to prevent a country or nation into humanitarian crisis, war or genocide, even terrorism. I do know for a fact that countries that respect religious freedom naturally have stability, harmony, social harmony, tolerance. Conversely, the countries that invest a lot of money on police, in the case of China, naturally creates a lot of resentment, end up being criticized in the global arena. So international religious freedom, and also a way to prevent a government's being in a difficult, challenging situation like what we have today in the United States and our relationship with Communist China. Had the United States government paid attention early on when we saw a series of early warning signs, starting from 9/11, when the Communist China trying to manipulate US-led war on terrorism as an excuse to persecute religious minorities, we may have been able to prevent some of the atrocity crimes being committed against the religious. And also, I worry in a global and geopolitical sense, international religious freedom also helps to create a healthy bilateral, multilateral relationship. So I can go on the list of benefits. And then most importantly, I think this is a national security issue. Some countries have realized this. Our country is coming around. If you pay attention to it, and if you treat it the same way that the bad guys are treating the freedom issues, then we can prevent a lot of persecution, atrocity crimes, and war crimes that we're dealing with in Ukraine and other places. So to me, it's more than just speaking out on behalf of persecuted religious minorities.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Excellent. So, Ambassador Sujay.
So both of my colleagues are so right in terms of persecution prevention, human rights and dignity, but also we found definitely pieces there when there's more religious freedom efforts, the efforts for people to live peaceably, but also to live with dignity. But also you look at the world, most of the world has a religious background. And so people need to have the right to do that. When we ignore religious freedom, it is saying to the world that your traditions that are hundreds and thousands of years old really are meaningless. And we found for people's faith, is ultimately what helps them to soar. And so for people to have the right to wear their attire, to be able to believe and worship as they believe, allows for an explosively wonderful society as opposed to one that's persecuted and stays underground.
Excellent. So a taproot of our other rights, a central component to security and an ultimate component of human dignity. Let me start with you, Sujay, just with a question. You served as the ambassador for international religious freedom. What challenges do you see in making religious freedom a reality as a good for all, both internally and externally, when you're thinking about the U.S. government's challenge?
Oh, many challenges, but two of them are that many governments still have not taken it up as their mantle. And so we were only able to deal with certain governments that actually came to the table and said we want to deal with religious freedom. But certainly the issue of women at the table was very rare. And in most cases, when I went to the diplomatic table, women either sat in the circle around our circle, the outer circle, or were outside, and if they were inside, they were serving tea, but they were not part of the conversation. So the issue of women and religious freedom is very dear to my heart. Around the world, it still has not even gotten to the level of having some attention on it. And so that's been one of my passions, is to bring women's voices to the table, and I will continue to do that as long as I shall live.
Two additional points on that I forgot to mention. Preservation of religious sites, preservation of religious architecture, and also preservation of children's rights is also part of international religious freedom. We have seen it when a bad actor or entities, officials targeting a particular religious, ethno-religious group, they look at first women and children. And they start destructing, every day is Kristallnacht is the kind of a metaphor that we have seen repeatedly.
Well, let me stay on that, Nury. You lead the U.S. Commission for International Religious Freedom. You're a scholar and advocate for the rights of many, particularly those in and from China. The world, in many ways, is turning a blind eye to very well-documented and widely known abuses unfolding in China because of China's economic or military or political clout in the world and its power and its willingness to reach those sources of power outside of its country. How do you make the case for why we should worry about the religious freedom of any minority or any group in China when we've got these bigger issues?
In the case of religious persecution in China, the Chinese authorities have integrated any social issues, freedom issues, even economic issues, environmental issues under the national security strategy, which is, again, kind of a dangerous trend. Everything that you demand as a human being, as Professor Scharffs was mentioning, is our fundamental right. You're treated as somebody or entity, a threat to national security. So this is something that the international community is not getting. And also speaking out when we see this kind of atrocities is part of state parties, specifically in the case of Genocide Convention, their treaty obligation. They have to speak out, they have to call it, they have to stop and hold them to account. So to date, only 10 governments and parliaments in the case of Uyghur genocide have spoken out. And also one of the biggest problems that I identified and it frustrates me daily is the fact that we are allowing bad actors like Xi Jinping to normalize behaviors such as forced sterilization of middle-aged women, purposefully preventing natural population growth, but in one instance 65%, locking up 800,000 to 1 million children away, and also developing some of the most sophisticated technological tools, such as a brain control weaponry that the United States government added to the entity list in 2021. So these kind of behaviors should be resolutely said no. You hear a lot of impassioned statements, speeches on Ukraine. I have to see heads of state, a head of government, make similar type of impassioned statements. So this is the lack of leadership, lack of political will, and also entanglement and economic interest. That has to stop.
And just the centrality of China's abuse of religious groups, of minorities of all different types is just so intertwined with its ability to grow economically, its ability to be a stronger power in the world because they're able to.
They're also normalizing, exporting and normalizing the similar behavior.
Absolutely.
And others might end up paying the price.
Yes, yes, we see that around the world where China is supporting so many authoritarian regimes. Brett, let me turn to you. You've written and spoken about human dignity as the basis for human rights and particularly religious freedom. I love the term you used in a recent talk about climate change, but climate change in the area of human rights. Can you speak to how religious freedom fits into that equation? For people who believe really different things, how do we move from tolerance to respect, which is one of the terms you've used many times?
Thank you. This year, we commemorate the 75th anniversary of the United Nations unanimous adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And when the drafting committee was working on that document, there was a lot of disagreement about what rights should be included and what it should look like. And it was when they really focused on human dignity, which was a concept that was mentioned in the preamble to the UN Charter, that progress was made. Human dignity became the truly universal value around which the conversations were built. And so if you look at the first sentence of the preamble of the UDHR, the first article of the UDHR, in both places you'll find human dignity. Now, today what we see is a politicization of human rights and a polarization around human rights. And what we have come to believe is that we need to reset human rights discourse around that foundational concept of human dignity, and hopefully it will perform a role in our age similar to the role that it played in the founding era of international human rights. And so through a process of study, distillation, conferences, we've come up with the formulation human dignity for everyone, everywhere. And this is the foundational principle, not just for human rights, but for religious freedom. This is perhaps seen most explicitly in Dignitatis Humanae, the Catholic Vatican II doctrine of religious freedom, where religious freedom is rooted in the dignity of the human person, and along with the right to religious freedom comes the duty to seek and live truth. And so this is related to what we might think of as our deepest human right, which is the right to be human. Right. And this means being able to pursue the true, the right, and the good, to have the constitutional space in which to live lives where we seek and try to live truth.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. Let me go back down the line now, thinking forward about what are the tools and the things that we are going to need. Do we have everything we need to make religious freedom a much more integrated and focal point for the international community? Let me start with you, Ambassador. As you're seeing, within the U.S. government or in other circles, what are the additional tools that we need, or where's that impetus need to come from?
I think Brett's word about reset, we have to reset in terms of where we are today, but the tools certainly are diplomacy, public diplomacy. We also have to make sure that we integrate the conversation into the foreign policy and the national security discussions so that religious freedom doesn't become the bottom of the totem pole. Many times we got to our issue after everything else in government was taken care of. It has to be prioritized in our foreign policy and our national security discussions. One of the things we were able to do was create the Religion and Foreign Policy Working Group, which is still embraced by government now, and also Female Faces of Faith. And I think as long as we continue to bring everyone to the table, those who believe and those who don't have the right to not believe, but as long as we bring everyone to the table, that's one of the tools we can use to begin a real conversation that resets the conversation.
Nury, how do you see where are the opportunities, particularly in the spheres that are focused on security or on economic issues and interests, to insert religious freedom to make it a more integrated and connected issue to those things which do motivate most governments and policymakers?
The area that I follow closely is China, the country. Two things comes to mind. One is their economic interest in the context of global supply chain crisis. We need to find a way to address corporate complicity, whether it be through consumer activism or adding additional legal tools mandated by the US Congress. The existing laws are outdated. We're dealing with a massive global problem in that vulnerable ethno-religious groups have been enslaved in the global supply chain. So we got to tell the business leaders that not in my name. And we need to create a very, very strong legal risk, reputational risk, and investment risk so that we can help to change their behavior. The other area is, again, going back to the technology. The science and technology development in China has not been a moral progress. We need to find a way to address, for example, in the case of one of those Chinese high-tech giants, Hikvision, installed 400 million cameras in China. Their market is saturated. They're looking for markets around the world. As we speak, more than 80 countries around the world already adopted Chinese surveillance technology. Companies like ZTE gaining ground in some countries that have a religious persecution problem and human rights abuses with this popular street light with a motion detector light. We have a Huawei that has more than cloud storage contract with more than 140 countries. That shows that our privacy has been compromised. The authoritarian regime, bad actors have been equipped with the technology provided by the Chinese state. So these are the two areas. And also I'm a very, very firm believer of sanctioning. The human rights abusers should not allowed to remain anonymous. We should call them out publicly. We should go after them, whether it be entity or individual. We should also expand the sanction to the network. It's working. You know, it's hard to see the immediate effect. It takes time for sanctions to show whether it's working or not. But we already start seeing the effect in the case of Russia, in the case of China. Huawei is not the same company as it was 3 years ago as a result of our sanctioning entity listing. So those are the areas that I would focus.
Can I just follow up on that? Have you seen, I'm sorry, did you have a?
I was going to say economic sanctions were used a lot, particularly for the countries of particular concern. But we also developed some toolkits, like with Saudi Arabia and other countries, with steps that you can begin to take to get off of that list of countries of particular concern. And I think that we also have to offer some tools, which was your question, that says you won't be in the same place next year as you are right now. Economic sanctions is one of them, but there can be some tools that you can begin to see a difference made. And I think we have to make sure that we offer those as well.
And both positive inducements as well as
Definitely.
punitive.
Definitely.
And I was just going to follow up with you, Nury. Are there areas where you have seen a pushback on this movement of China, particularly from the corporate space?
Green technology space. Elon Musk is the biggest proponent, or at least in publicly. Elon Musk never hesitated to criticize our government, the European government, but he doesn't do the same thing with China, because the batteries for his Tesla cars coming from China, reportedly made with the slave labor, solar panel industry. So the environmental activists need to know that it's our moral obligation to save the human being while we try to preserve the climate. We can fight genocide and ecocide at the same time. I think society, that's one of the biggest challenges we're confronting in the case of China.
Excellent. Brett, in the space that you are most active in, which is the law and international legal frameworks, are we missing anything? Is there something that we can do in that space that needs to be amended or added or changed in that space?
One thing we're really focused on this 75th anniversary year is really thinking about the universality of human dignity. And so we're going to have 3 book projects, one on Asian perspectives on human dignity, one on African perspectives on human dignity, and several conferences culminating in a book on Islamic perspectives on human dignity. We really need to understand each other's way of thinking about these fundamental values a little bit better than we do. We need to get a little bit more attuned at listening. We have pretty good legal tools to some extent. International law we think about a lot, but much more likely it's going to be national law and local law that really affects the lives people lead. When we look for religious discrimination, we find it in registration laws, we find it in land use and zoning. Those are the places where we find religious discrimination frequently, including in the United States. You asked about tolerance and respect, and I think these are both really important principles. Sometimes we downplay the importance of tolerance and talk about how we need respect instead. And I understand that. But tolerance is a really useful legal concept. We can enforce through our law the requirement that we tolerate one another, that we give each other the space to live our lives, even if our values are different one from another. Respect, I think, is really a political principle. It's something that we need to demonstrate in our political lives, in our social lives, in our interactions with each other. But I'm not sure it works well as a legally mandated principle, much less love. That's actually what we really want. But we don't want it as a legal principle. We want it as a moral and religious principle. I think of the Hamilton musical where King George is a comic figure who says he is going to send his troops to kill your friends and relatives to show you his love. And we don't need coercive love. What we need is love as a religious principle, as a moral principle. We need respect as a political principle and as a social principle. And we need to enforce tolerance as a legal principle where we actually let each other disagree with one another. And we create enough constitutional space where we can try to live our visions of the true, the right, and the good.
That is a great point to end on. Let me thank all of our panelists for excellent comments and all the work they're doing, and wish all of you a wonderful time at this excellent conference, and that it gives a lot of impetus to the work that you're doing to change where we are globally on religious freedom. Thank you.
We're going to take a
Now mankind is more aggrieved than ever in every possible way, from the indignities of poverty and oppression to the ravages of war and violence, and the humiliation of slavery and trafficking. It is time for humanity and religions to come together and collectively lift mankind out of this sorry plight. At the start of February 2018, over 200 religious leaders and senior politicians from the 3 Abrahamic faiths and other world religions gathered at a hotel in Washington to launch the modern alliance of virtue between religions. It was a momentous occasion headed by a steering committee led by His Eminence Sheikh Abdullah bin Daya,